with fairy tales of the Gilded Age and Reconstruction. Special Field Order 15 was military orders issued during the American Civil War on January 16, 1865 by General Sherman, and it basically confiscated as federal property a strip of coastal land extending about 30 miles inland from the Atlantic and stretching from Charleston, South Carolina to Jacksonville, Florida. Andrew Johnson revoked Special Field Order 15 in the fall of 1865 after Abraham Lincoln's assassination. Effects on blacks post-Civil War. So the 13th Amendment officially abolished slavery in the United States, and blacks sought freedom and moved to large cities in the South to escape. Moving on to the Freedmen's Bureau. Its main goal was to establish schools, provide aid to the poor and aged, and settle disputes. It also provided medical care, but economically there were several problems. The vision of free labor was established and worked on through this bureau, and it ultimately resulted in ex-slaves being more productive. The failure of land reform. Blacks wanted land of their own, not jobs on plantations. President Johnson ordered nearly all land in federal hands to go back to its former owners. A committee of former slaves eventually drew up petitions to Howard and Johnson asking for homesteads and stated that they were promised homesteads by the government and declared that they were essential to reach the full potential of their freedom. Because no land distribution took place and the vast majority of freed people remained poor and within poverty, they had no alternative but to work on white-owned plantations, often for their former owners. New South. The war had a negative effect on small farmers, and sharecropping dominated most of the South and most of Tobacco Belt. Sharecropping initially arose as a compromise between blacks' desire for land and planters' desire for labor discipline. The crop lien system used small crops as collateral for loans from merchants and supplies. Failure of presidential reconstruction. Johnson's plan offered pardons to the white Southern elite. He offered a pardon which restored political and property rights for all except slaves. His plan allowed the new state government a free hand in managing local affairs, and he excluded Confederate leaders and wealthy plant owners whose pre-war property had been valued at $20,000 or more. Most of the Republican North was against this policy. Andrew Johnson, the vice president of Lincoln, inaugurated in May of 1865, held opposite views from Lincoln, basically meaning that he was against the freedom of blacks. The task of restoring the Union was given to him, and he lacked Lincoln's political skills and keen sense of public opinion. He also believed African Americans had no role to play in Reconstruction. Black codes were laws passed by the new Southern government in an attempt to regulate the lives of former slaves. These laws violated free labor principles and called forth a vigorous response from the Republican North and showed that the abolition of slavery did not mean immediate freedom. Radical Republicans did not agree with most of what Johnson had to say. They shared the conviction that the Union victory created a golden opportunity to institute the principle of equal rights for all, regardless of race.
Following the Civil Rights Bill, Congress approved the 14th Amendment, which stated that all people born in the United States would be considered U.S. citizens regardless of race. This excluded the Native Americans because they subjected to tribal authority rather than the central government. The amendment prohibited states from giving special privileges to certain race groups or of denying any person equal protection of the laws. This amendment produced a division between the political parties, with not a single Democrat in Congress voting in its favor. However, the amendment still did get passed. Andrew Johnson was the first president to be impeached as a result of his actions after the Tenure of Office Act, which stated that the president could not remove office holders without the Senate's approval. The House of Representatives approved his articles of impeachment, and he was impeached in 1868. Ulysses S. Grant was the next elected president. Grant won the election of 1868, and Congress adopted this era's final amendment. The 15th Amendment prevented the government from denying any U.S. citizens' right to vote because of their race. It did not, however, extend the right to vote to women. Reconstruction was seen as an opportunity to claim emancipation for women. Since slavery was gone, women searched for ways to make the promise of free labor real for women. They wanted equal job opportunities and equal pay. However, talk of women's suffrage and redesigning marriage laws had few sympathetic male listeners. Many women were unhappy with the legislation being passed during this era because it did nothing to improve the lives of women, and it rejected the idea that freedom should be given to all people regardless of sex. The new Southern government also brought about new groups of whites, such as carpetbaggers and scalawags. Carpetbaggers were northern whites who packed all their belongings and moved to the South after the war. The large majority of them were former Union soldiers who decided to remain in the South. On the other hand, scalawags were non-slaveholding white farmers from the Upper South. Many were wartime Unionists who now cooperated with the Republicans and were considered traitors. They hoped. The Ku Klux Klan, or the KKK, was a terrorist organization led by mostly members of the Democratic Party in the South. After the Civil War, the Klan launched a series of attacks known as the Reign of Terror, which targeted mostly Republican Party leaders. These attacks were so violent and out of control that the government was unable to suppress the KKK, so they put forth 3 enforcement acts outlawing terrorist societies and allowing the president to use armed forces against them. The KKK went out of existence in 1872, but not for good, as they would re-emerge later in history. The 1867 election would choose Ulysses S. Grant's successor. Due to the closeness of the election, whichever candidate claimed the only 3 remaining Republican states in the South, South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana, would win the election. The election was between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel J. Tilden. The election was unable to be resolved on its own, so Congress appointed 15-member Electoral Commission, which had a Republican majority, to decide. Hayes won the election, but a negotiation emerged. Hayes would place a Southerner in his cabinet as Postmaster General, and he would work for federal aid to Texas and the Pacific Railroad, while the Democrats would then not dispute against Hayes's right to office.
The Second Industrial Revolution. So in 1913, the U.S. made 1/3 of all of the industrial output. There was a shift in workforce from farms to cities and factories. The U.S. had many natural resources, growing labor, expanding markets, investment capital, and government support. Railroads in the national market. So from 1860 to 1890, mileage almost tripled. And in 1869, the first transcontinental railroad was created, which this then created a national market for goods, Montgomery Ward, Sears, etc. There were 2 main people that played a huge role during this time. Carnegie, he set out to establish a steel company and use something known as vertical integration, which meant to produce steel, he controlled every phase of the business, all the way from raw materials to transportation, manufacturing, and distribution. There was also John D. Rockefeller, which he created an oil monopoly by 1880 and controlled 90% of the oil industry in the U.S., and he used something known as horizontal integration, basically meaning he controlled the refinery and corporation acquires or merges with competitors. So this was basically the idea that only the fittest would survive, and this justified class distinction and poverty for most. William Graham Sumner enforced this, and in the Republic. So the Knights of Labor, created in 1869, was the first national union, and they demanded an 8-hour workday, and they resisted social Darwinism and liberty of contract. The Great Railroad Strike also took place, where demonstrations nationwide in support of striking world workers refusing to work. Social gospel, which were basically ideas preached by liberal Protestants advocating for the application of Christian principles to social problems. They wanted to expand Protestant churches in poorer communities. So basically, the churches must help the poor. And they also worked with the Knights of Labor. There was also the Haymarket Affair, which was violence during anarchist protests at Haymarket Square, Chicago. There were 8 deaths that led to a trial of 8 anarchist leaders. And so this did not work out at all for the unions, and it was a huge fail. Nation of the West.
The Homestead Act encouraged farmers to move west. It allowed families to gain land and would provide cheap land. There were bonanza farms, which were large farms covering thousands of acres and employed hundreds of wage laborers in the West. Chinese immigration also continued during this time. Conflict on the Mormon frontier. The Mormons had moved to Great Salt Lake Valley in the 1840s, hoping to practice their religion free of the persecution that they had encountered in the East. But the president replaced Brigham Young with a non-Mormon leader, and Young did not comply, so the troops were sent to Utah, and Utah banned the idea of polygamy. Native Americans in the West. So the Battle of Little Bighorn was a major Indian American battle. It was one of the most famous Indian victories by the Sioux and the Cheyenne, led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, which they defended the land in the Black Hills. The land was invaded after discovering gold. It took place in 1876 in Montana. Combined warriors, they massacred much of the U.S. There were 250 deaths on the U.S. side. The Dawes Act. So this law was passed in 1876 to encourage adoption of white norms. This broke up tribal holdings into small farms for Indian families. Indians were forced to basically assimilate with the white culture, and basically they had to give their land to most of the whites. In politics, Boss Tweed created the Tweed Ring, which was a profit-sharing organization and forged close ties with railroad men and labor unions. There was the Grange, which was founded in 1867 and claimed more than 700,000 members by the mid-1870s. They moved to establish cooperatives for soaring in farm output and strive to regulate railroads.